Well, thank you so much for having me to come and share a little of my experience with you. I've entitled this talk, Physician Burnout, a National Medical Emergency. What started in slow motion some years ago is now rapidly accelerating. Physician burnout is becoming a huge problem in our industry. And before I started working for NCPHP, I was a family physician in Goldsboro for 24 years. That's about an hour east of here. In 2009, I went to my partner and I said, unless something changes, I'm going to have to leave the practice of medicine. I felt exhausted, not only physically, but mentally. It's hard to describe, but I felt even like my soul was exhausted. I'd become kind of cynical and detached from my patients. I no longer felt like I was in the game with them, that I was somehow an independent observer, and I was getting very cynical. And I really didn't feel like I was making a difference in the lives of my patients anymore. I didn't know it at the time, but those are the three hallmarks of burnout, and I'll go over those in a few moments. So my partner said, do whatever you need to do, just don't leave. We had a very busy family practice. He said, take some time, make yourself better if you can, and come back. So I made what I thought was a few very simple changes early on. I reduced my work week. It meant a cut in salary, but at that time I would have paid somebody to make me feel better. So I paid myself, took the cut, but I went to 3 days a week. I was on about 10 boards because I had this problem saying no. So I got off about 8 of them and stayed on the 1 or 2 that I really cared about. I started reading more, I started exercising more, started taking hikes in the wilderness and the woods, reading stuff outside of medicine, picked up some old hobbies, and within weeks I felt immediately better. So I went online and began to look and do a little searching, and it didn't take me long to figure out that I had been burned out. I burned out on the practice of medicine. And I thought, well, I wonder if any of my colleagues are suffering. So it didn't take but a 5 or 10 minute Google search to figure out that this was a big, huge problem in medicine and getting worse. So I began to read everything I could about job-related burnout and began to do some talks on it, and that's sort of been my path since 2009. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the scope, the costs, the hallmarks, of which there are 3. There's 3 hallmarks to job-related burnout. There's 6 causes. I'm going to go over those, and some viable remedies. Now, some of this may sound familiar to you. We'll see. Burnout is an innate hazard of our profession. We deal with some really kind of sticky, gooey issues, some very emotional issues with our patients. Now, in medical school, they talked about detached empathy. We want you to be empathetic and sympathetic with your patients, but you should remain detached so you don't, take on their emotional baggage or burdens. Well, that sounds good in theory, but I will tell you that it's nearly impossible. The most glaring example of that I can give you is one day a mom came into my practice very frantic, upset, crying, extremely emotional. Her husband had been tragically killed in an automobile accident that morning. She said, "My 9-year-old daughter's in the car. I don't know how to tell her. Will you please help me?" You can't be emotionally detached from something like that completely, unless you've got a heart of stone. She cried, the little girl cried, I cried right along with them. So over the years, it's just a lot of little emotional impacts, and they do build up over time if you don't have some mechanisms in place to deal with them adequately. So it's an innate hazard of our profession. It's progressive in nature. If you don't really correct the underlying causes of burnout, it will progress. And I'll give you some reasons why that happens. Burnout is impossible to alleviate unless you get at the underlying causes, of which there are 6 major ones. So let's look at the costs. It may surprise you to know that replacing just one physician on your staff costs anywhere from $150,000 to $1 million, depending on the specialty. You say, well, how can that be? That's a lot of money to replace a doctor. Well, you know, if you get a headhunter to help you find an internist, it can be $30,000, $40,000 to find a physician once they sign on. Sometimes there's moving expenses. There's lost productivity because you've got a hole in your ability to produce until you fill it. And then when the physician arrives, it can be 2 or 3 months before they get to provider numbers. I guarantee you the electronic health record's different, so they'll need training. By the way, in my opinion, the electronic health record was created by Satan and his minions. The same Beelzebub that gave us ICD-10. So it can cost a lot, anywhere from $150,000, $250,000 for an internist, all the way up to $1 million for a neurosurgeon. It's very expensive. So in facilities or hospitals where turnover is high, this is a big bleed to the bottom line. Very expensive. So what about the hallmarks of burnout? There's 3. Now, I was hiking in Arizona, outside of Sedona, and I hiked up to the top of this mesa, and there stood this tree. This tree was burned, and it was dead, but it was still standing. And that's how people who are burned out feel. I'm dead, but I'm dead on the inside, but I'm still standing. They will tell you that they just don't have the feel for medicine that they once did. The first hallmark is emotional exhaustion. That's where you feel like you can no longer give on an emotional or psychological level to your patient. I hear people say it. I don't have anything left to give. I've left it all out there. There's nothing for me to offer anymore. They feel emotionally exhausted. I felt that way. I felt exhausted. Even after a weekend off, I still felt exhausted when I went into work and saw that big pile of work on my desk that had to be done and a big long list of patients to see that day. By the way, these hallmarks are elucidated by Christina Maslach back in the 80s, and she developed the Maslach Burnout Inventory, which is a tool we apply to measure burnout with sensitivity and specificity in an individual. It's very sensitive and specific, and there are 3 domains. You've heard the first one, emotional exhaustion. The second one is depersonalization. That's where you become cynical and start to detach from your patients. You almost feel like in some way they're deserving of their problems. The last hallmark is a lack of a sense of personal accomplishment. That's where you feel like what you do no longer has any value, or you don't feel like you're making a difference. You know, I'd slog through the schedule all day long, big pile of charts. I'd do all those, and the next day it was all right back there all over again. Patients were coming in, their hemoglobin A1Cs were higher, they've gained more weight, they're not taking their medicines like they're supposed to, and you know the story. So, am I making a difference anymore? I began to question that. So those are the 3 hallmarks. Now these are symptoms, they are not the causes. These are the symptoms. So think about these. Emotional exhaustion, keyword exhaustion. The development of cynicism or depersonalization, keyword cynicism, and a lack of a sense of personal accomplishment or inefficacy. Do any of those sound familiar? Now I will tell you that I don't care what profession you're in, there's a detectable rate of burnout, and people can float in and out of burnout based on circumstances. So almost everybody in the room has felt one or more of these at some point in their career or in other jobs that they had before they got into medicine. But these are the 3 hallmarks. Now stress is different than burnout. When large hospitals or organizations are experiencing high turnover rates, lots of patient complaints, lots of provider complaints, and efficiencies are dropping instead of going up, They usually haul in a bunch of stress management people. They say, oh, our physicians must be stressed. So they'll bring in the yoga teachers and the mindfulness people and the meditation folks. And the subtle message there is you don't know how to take care of your burnout, so we're going to teach you. It's kind of demeaning. And it will not get at the underlying causes of burnout, so you really haven't corrected anything. So how is stress different from burnout? Stress is characterized by overengagement. Burnout's just the opposite of that. It's disengagement. It's detachment. With stress, the emotions are overactive. In burnout, the emotions are blunted. In stress, it produces urgency and hyperactivity. With burnout, you get a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. Now, what does that sound like when you're hopeless and helpless? Depressed? Does it surprise anyone that the rates of depression are much higher in individuals who are burned out versus individuals who are stressed? Now, if you are burned out, I can guarantee you with 100% assurance you are stressed. But you can be stressed without being burned out. A lot of times when physicians burn out or providers, they will act out. Sometimes they act out with drugs, sometimes they act out with alcohol, sometimes it's bad or aberrant behaviors. The worst way providers act out is with suicide. Last year in the U.S., over 400 physicians committed suicide. They didn't ask for the help that they needed because many times they do not feel like it's available to them, or they'll be looked upon differently. And so they don't get the help that they need. And when desperate and when disinhibited by drugs and alcohol, they will often carry out a plan that has a certain finality. Stress leads to loss of energy. Burnout leads to a loss of hope and motivation and ideals. Stress leads to anxiety disorders. Burnout can lead to depression. With stress, the damage is primarily physical. With burnout, the damage is primarily emotional. Stress may kill you prematurely. On the other hand, burnout will make you feel like life is just not worth living, and it increases your risk of suicide. Stress is more easily identified and treated. Burnout, not so much so. Stress is always recognized by the individual. Burnout, on the other hand, may not be. I knew something was wrong with me, but I really didn't feel depressed, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I couldn't describe it. I couldn't really tell you or explain to you what was going on with me when I was feeling burned out. So it can go unrecognized, or it'll be laid off to stress. So if you treat burnout like stress, you've not really got at the underlying causes, and you may not have any impact. Now, the causes of burnout, there are 6 major mismatches between the individual and the job they're being asked to do that creates burnout. It's a conflict. There are 6 major ones. It's a conflict between the individual and the job they're being asked to do. Now, there are more than 6 causes, but there are 6 major causes. And again, these were elucidated by Christina Maslach back in the 80s. Unless you correct the underlying causes, you cannot alleviate burnout. And it's not just the presence or absence of the cause, it's the degree to which they're present. So you could have 3 or 4 of these causes that are present to a minimal degree, and there can be no burnout. On the other hand, there could be just one of these mismatches present to a very high degree, and people could be burning out all over the place. So it's not just the presence or absence, it's the degree. So let's go over these 6. Mismatch number 1. By the way, I took a picture. I was in La Gomera, Spain. I was hiking. I took a picture during the daytime and at night out my window. And that's the difference between the ideal and what's actually taking place with these mismatches. The difference is between night and day. Work overload. Does anybody in here feel work overloaded? Just a little bit? You know, when you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else. Everybody in here gets 168 hours a week. So if somebody walks up to you and says, please, would you do this thing for me? Would you be sit on my board, or would you be the physician for my little league team here? You have to stop and think, do I have margin in my life? Do I have the time to do that? Because if you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else. With physicians, it's completely different. It's one more guideline, one more mandate, one more electronic health record system iteration, one more box to check, one more question to ask. What, if anything, is ever taken off our plate? If you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else. Is it any wonder that 20 years ago the average patient visit was 14 minutes and today it's 6 to 8? Work overload. Physician, I hear it all the time, I work hard all day long and then I end up taking my charts home with me to complete because I can't get all the work done during the day. This is non-sustainable. There is a point that will be reached where you can't add anything else to the system. And we're very close to that now. You know, physicians will tolerate a lot. They will tolerate, 80% of their day can be crap. If 20% of it, just 20% of it, tickles that little bone inside, the reason that they got into medicine in the first place, they will hang in there like troopers. They will ignore that 80% of crap. Because the 20%, they get enough intangible reward from it that they will keep doing what they're doing. They'll put their head down and just grind away. The problem is we're now beginning to chip away at that 20%, those tangible and intangible rewards that lead physicians to become physicians in the first place. Work overload, that's the first mismatch. Second mismatch, lack of control. As organizations grow, they tend to want to centralize control. They want to make everything standard. Now, I've been in medicine almost 30 years, and I can tell you I've never seen a standard patient. Where are these people? Where are the normal standard patients? You can't standardize a system for non-standard people. But yet that's what we try to do. When you tend to centralize control, you stifle innovation and creativity at the point of service. Such that sometimes you know exactly what needs to be done, but the third-party payer won't let you. It's lack of control. Third mismatch, insufficient reward. I mentioned it a minute ago. We get into medicine for tangible and intangible rewards. You take a job for salary, absolutely, probably some benefits, time off. There are intangible rewards, the prestige of the job, the fact that you feel like you're using your natural talents and abilities in a way that satisfies you and your core values. Problem solving, using your knowledge, intangible rewards. Our current system is chipping away at both intangible and tangible rewards. Many physicians have found their salaries stagnant or decreasing. The amount of time that they get off is decreasing. The amount of time they have to spend on committees, huddled up in a room somewhere trying to solve an insolvable problem that has nothing to do with patient care. It's very frustrating. Mismatch number 4, breakdown of community. Now this is a community. Your workplace is a community. How well do you know the physicians in your community? Physicians used to be more collegial. We'd get together and talk about our successes, our losses, our problems, or just shoot the breeze or talk about our hobby or our kids. Remember, when you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else. If you are in a JCO approved accredited hospital, Joint Commission accredited hospital, you have privileges there. You have to serve on a number of committees. I had to serve on 3 when I had privileges at my hospital. So there's opportunity. When you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else. The opportunity to be collegial and to get together has diminished. Such that I was in one group of radiologists. There's 12 radiologists in a group, somewhere here in Carolina. And I was listening to them talk about the problems they were having, and one physician pulled me aside and said everything would be just great if it wasn't for that new guy. Now, he had been into practice, 30-some years, and the new guy had been there 4 or 5. He says he's always late. He's always behind in his charting or reading films, and he disappears often. And if we could just get control of him, life here would be great. They did not know that radiologist had a special needs child at home that required a lot of attention. The radiologist didn't feel like he could burden the other physicians in their group with that problem, and that it probably even wouldn't be welcome news. That's a breakdown of community. If you don't know the physicians that are working down the hall from you and what their circumstances are, I challenge you, ask some questions, get involved. Maybe that's why so many physicians are committing suicide. They feel too isolated nowadays. Absence of fairness. When I'm on the phone with Blue Cross Blue Shield arguing with the medical director that my patient who's sitting in front of me, that I've examined, I know their history, I know their resources, I know what they can afford, what they can't afford, I know the best medicine for them, and I'm arguing, this patient needs this drug. It costs $30 more a month than the drug you want to give them. And they're telling me no. When the CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield makes $1,550 an hour. That's $3.6 million. Doesn't include benefits. Now, not about begrudge anybody what they make, but there's a certain absence of fairness there when I know what the patient needs and I can't get it for them because they say it's too expensive. Absence of fairness. Conflicting values. Now, this was a big one for me. Some days, every day I went to work, I felt like I was violating my oath. Because increasingly, payers and other external forces were inserting themselves between me and the patient to the point where they were front-running medical decisions without my permission or without the patient's permission. Our first charge is to do no harm. I knew harm was being done to some of my patients because of factors I could not control and they could not control. It was a big issue with me, conflicting values. This is one mismatch. If it's high up on the scale, you will drive people off in droves, because if your organization says we're all about patient care, we're all about doing the right thing, we're all about correcting our mistakes, and behind the scenes that's not the case. And in some cases, if you're being asked to misrepresent or even lie, this will get people off in droves. Conflicting values. So look at the list. Work overload, lack of control, insufficient reward, breakdown of community, absence of fairness, conflicting values. Do any of those resonate with you? Do you feel like any of those may be present in your workspace? Viable remedies. I will tell you that only 10% of the time will a doctor burn themselves out, or a PA, or a nurse, or anybody in healthcare. Only 10% of the time will they burn themselves out. There are many reasons for that. Drugs, alcohol, a string of toxic relationships, and thereby divorces, leveraged up on debt. I can't tell you how many physicians we see at NCPHP in their 60s and even 70s who come to us broke, high income earners most of their life, come in penniless. It breaks my heart. It doesn't have to be that way. Physicians take on too much debt. It's a big, huge problem. So that can burn somebody out. 90% of the time it's the work environment. It's a toxic work environment that burns the individual out. They don't burn themselves out. It's the presence of those mismatches that I just went over. So what do you do about it? Well, there's individual remedies, there's organizational remedies. Most of the time when a provider burns themselves out, their life is out of balance. At least that's what we see. Physicians are very good with their mental realm. They're extremely good at learning and knowing massive amounts of information, which they apply every day. Spiritual realm, physical realm, these suffer a lot sometimes. In fact, physicians are terrible at self-care. Most doctors don't have a doctor that they see regularly, yet we tell our patients that's what they should do. Most doctors don't do the cardiovascular exercise that we recommend our patients to do. I was really fussing at a patient one day. I said, "You really need some cardiovascular exercise." He said, "What do you do, doctor?" I wasn't doing anything. I felt ashamed. Now, just because I wasn't exercising, it did not obviate my responsibility to tell the patient they needed to exercise. But if I'm going to give somebody that kind of advice, I ought to at least partake of a little of my own advice. So I stopped by Walmart on the way home. I bought me some running clothes. I already had a good pair of shoes. So I went outside, put everything on. I felt immediately better. I thought I'll jog an easy mile. I used to run some in, high school. Now I'm 46 when this happened, but I used to run some in high school, so I'll just jog an easy mile. I made it 2,000 feet, which is 4/10 of a mile. Yes, I was one of those patients that I used to snicker at. I'd send them for a treadmill exercise test, and they'd go 3 minutes on the Modified Bruce Protocol, and I go, "Boy, are you out of shape." And that was me. I was horrified. I was in better shape in my head than I was in my body. So I ran that same distance every day. It's 4/10 of a mile. Ran it every day for a week. And then I added 528 feet, and I ran that every day for a week. And I added another 528 feet. Ran that for a week. Eventually worked up to 1.5 miles, and I jumped up to 2, and I started running 3. And then a pathologist at the hospital said, "You should come run with us. We run long." I said, "What's long?" He said, 6, 8s, and 10s. I thought, "Oh my God, it's taking me forever to get to 3. But you know what? They got me there. And in fact, the pathologist, when I ran my first half marathon, he ran it with me. It was down at the Battleship in Wilmington. And he had run the Boston Marathon the weekend before. So 26 miles the weekend before, and now he's running 13.1 with me. He was 67 at the time, and he slowed down for me. He didn't start running until he was in his 40s. So physicians, we need to take our own advice. Exercise regularly, eat better, drop some pounds, see our doctors regularly. Spiritual realm doesn't necessarily mean religion. It can mean religion, but do you feel connected to your colleagues? Do you feel connected to your family? Do you feel connected to mankind, this planet? Do you have a manifesto on life and a philosophy for living? Do you take hikes in the woods? That's a spiritual pursuit. I talked to someone just before, as everybody was getting their food. That's a spiritual pursuit. The creative arts. A lot of physicians play music or paint. If you've done that in the past, are you still doing it? Or do you not have time anymore? So attending each of these realms keeps people out of trouble in terms of burning their own selves out. So, how do you nourish these realms? Well, there's many ways. You'll see some items up there on the board for nourishing your mental, your emotional, your physical, your spiritual realm. There's one thing in common to all of them, and it's play. I know we feel like we're all grown up now, and we don't have to play anymore. But believe you me, there's an inner child in each of you that's begging you to come outside and play. And too often we say, "Not now, I don't have time." And I remember my dad saying that to me. My dad worked hard. And I cherished the moments that we went outside and played catch or did something. But sometimes he would say, "Not now. I don't have time." I know how I felt then. I know how I feel now when I say that to myself. Do you take a week off every 3 months? Why not? Why not 4 weeks off a year? At least once a year, you each need to get away by yourself and unplug from your devices, because I will tell you that will give you the decompression, the time to consider where you are in your life and where you want to be. Am I on the path from where I am to where I want to be? We're too busy to stop and think about that in the everyday practice of medicine and everything else that we do. So take time off. And when I say unplug, this is Jeep Island in the Federated States of Micronesia. There's a little shack on one end of this island, and they will take you out there in a boat with some food and a radio, and they will not come back until you call them. And there's no internet, and there's no phone service, and there's no radio, and there's no TV. People get dropped off on that island thinking, how am I going to survive a week on this island? And then at the end of the 7th day, you can't pry them off with a crowbar. Because they discover things about themselves while they're there that they hadn't considered in the worrisome press of everyday living. So unplug. There are organizational strategies for dealing with burnout. This usually entails doing a survey and finding out what the rate of burnout is among the providers using the Maslach Burnout Inventory. And then you have to do a survey to figure out what those mismatches are, if they're present or not, and to what degree they're impacted. And then you have to set about the task of mitigating those mismatches. You have to change the work environment. You have to change workflow. Now, 5% or so of the hospitals and big provider groups in the country get it, and they have started changing their workflow and their work dynamics in a big way. For instance, why does clinic have to start at 8:30 and end at 5? Why can't it start at 6 in the morning? There are physicians in this room that would see their first patient at 6 if they could get off at 2 and go kayaking the rest of the afternoon, or play golf, or be with their family. There are other physicians that would like to come in at 10 and work till 6 or 7 because they'd like to take their kids to school. There are other physicians in this room that would really like to set their own book of business. Rather than have somebody appoint patients for them, they would like to be in charge of that. There are unique ways in mature systems. They have found that this isn't a drain on their bottom line. It's not only cost effective, it's income generating. Because when you get a completely engaged workforce, efficiencies go up, productivity goes up, complaints from patients go down, employee complaints go down, lawsuits go down, turnover, which again, a physician anywhere from $150,000 to $1 million a year to replace one doctor. For a fraction of that, you can put some programs in place that reduce turnover and get at these mismatches. So a consultation workflow would look like that. It would be an initial meeting. You gather some facts. You do the Maslach Burnout Inventory. You do a debriefing after that. You do what's called a areas of work-life survey, which identifies those 6 mismatches and which ones are being negatively impacted, and also which ones are being positively impacted, because you want to enhance those. You do a debriefing for that. You do a DISC personality profile, usually for communication purposes, because people like to give and receive their communication differently, and understanding that can clean up a lot of misunderstandings in the workplace. You do a debriefing for that. You put in some workplace redesign or some burnout mitigation programs. Then you go back later and you resurvey and see if you've moved the needle. It's not rocket science. All these tools are available and they're not expensive. Most of these inventories take about 10 or 15 minutes to complete. So, what's the opposite of burnout? Anybody know? It's engagement. It's the exact opposite of burnout. The hallmarks of engagement are vigor, dedication, and absorption. When you see somebody who's totally engaged, and you've seen them, whether they were in medicine or some other profession, you look at them, you can't tell, are they playing? Are they working? I don't know. I can't figure it out because they look like they're having too much fun. These are the people you have to tap on the shoulder and say, hey, it's time to eat. Or hey, it's time to go home. These people feel sad on Friday. Oh, darn. I have to go home. I can't wait till Monday. How many of you feel like that? have to leave this, look at what I get to do. That's what they'll say, look at what I get to do. Not what I have to do. Look at what I get to do. Vigor, dedication, absorption, energy, involvement, efficacy, the exact opposite of burnout. So how do you get there? You got to eliminate those job mismatches. Yes, resiliency training can help with the aftermath of burnout. The symptoms, it will not eliminate burnout, but if you've got a big burned out workforce, you have to do something on that end as well. Not only eliminate the mismatches, but try to mitigate the symptoms and get people feeling better as quickly as you can. Workplace redesign, absolutely. And coaching, we're doing more and more, we're referring more and more participants who come to NCPHP for individual coaching. It seems to work great for certain things. It's interesting. Physicians will spend $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 on a vehicle whose intrinsic value will go to zero, but they won't spend $6,000 on a coach that will get them from where they are to where they want to be. Name anybody in sports, anybody in any profession, even TV anchors, speakers, sports heroes, artists. They all have a coach. A coach sees things the individual doesn't. Even though they may have not ever attained the same success as the person they're coaching, they will see things that that person doesn't see. And they will hold them accountable for an actionable plan to get them from where they are to where they want to be. So if you don't plow about 2.5% of what you earn every year back into self-enrichment and programs or coaching, having a side, something on the side that you really enjoy doing and create, I suggest you do it. Give it a try. ncphp.org. We've been around since 1988. We assist physicians who have gotten in trouble, yes, with chemical dependency, drugs, alcohol, but also behavioral issues, mental health issues, cognitive difficulties, you name it, we've seen it. And just to show you how much we do in this state, these are not the places we've been, or these are not the places our participants live. Each pen represents 3 to 100 plus doctors. We've had over 4,000 physicians through our program since 1988. Most of them are still in practice today. Our success rate with chemical dependency at 5 years is 88%. It's a great program, it works, and it's a life preserver for many physicians who find themselves in need of some assistance. So if you know of a colleague who's struggling, approach them first, talk to them, see if you can help them. And if you feel like we can help them, then please refer them to us. Get them to pick up the phone and give us a call. You can also refer anonymously if you feel like somebody's having some trouble. We want to prevent those suicides before they happen. I have a website, clarkgaither.com. I do blog about burnout regularly. There's some resource tools on there too. There's a checklist for burnout. There's a physician burnout guide. There's a burnout guide for hospital administrators or large group administrators. There's a core values inventory. If you've never done a core values inventory, I strongly urge you to do it. If you ask most people, do you have values? They will say, well, yes, of course I have values. Well, what are they? Let's see, honesty, yep, honesty, and freedom, and I don't know. So what are your top 5 core values? They probably haven't changed a whole lot since you were a child. They may change position a little bit, but it's probably the same list. And what's your number 1 core value? Have you ever taken an inventory? If you don't know what all the core values are, there's 400 of them listed in the back of this core values inventory. The reason that's important is if you make decisions that are in alignment, you know, I talked about those conflicting values. If you make decisions that are in alignment with your core values, the outcomes are likely to be good. If you make decisions that go against your core values, the outcomes are likely to be bad. And we see this all the time where there's a mismatch between the individual's core values and their behavior. And once we get them lined up, a lot of their problems seem to melt away. So if you've never done a core values inventory, you can go and download it. There's no charge for anything on my website. Thank you so much for allowing me to come and share.